North Africa, late 1942. The desert sun beats down on jagged hills of rock and dust. German troops, hardened by years of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, move cautiously through the canyons of Tunisia. They know the rhythm of battle well, the sharp crack of bolt-action rifles, each shot followed by the pause of a soldier working the bolt. Crack, pause, crack. That was the music of war they had grown used to. But then came something different. From the opposite ridge erupted a staccato rhythm, unlike anything they had heard before. Not the endless chatter of a machine gun, but something uncanny, steady, rapid rifle fire that seemed to flow without pause. One German corporal later wrote in his diary, "Their rifles fired as if they were machine guns. We could not believe what we were hearing." It was the first time many German soldiers faced the M1 Garand. Dust kicked up in waves as American units poured fire across the wadi. A single platoon seemed to deliver twice the volume of shots the Germans expected. Men scrambled for cover, puzzled at how the enemy could fire so quickly without carrying automatic weapons. Some thought at first the Americans had smuggled hidden machine guns into the hills. Others believed they were facing new light automatics. But soon, captured rifles revealed the truth. Every ordinary U.S. infantryman carried a semi-automatic weapon. The contrast was stark. The Germans were armed primarily with the Carabiner 98K bolt-action rifle. A solid, reliable weapon, it had served them well across Europe. But it required the soldier to chamber a new round with every shot. Against an American armed with a Garand, the difference was crushing. The American could send 8 rounds downrange in the time it might take a German to fire 3. For German officers, this discovery was unnerving. They had been told Americans were soft, ill-prepared, lacking discipline. Yet here was proof that America had given its infantrymen something no other army had: a modern, mass-issued, semi-automatic rifle. For the GIs, it was a revelation in battle. They learned quickly that with the Garand, they could pin down enemy squads, keep heads low, and fight with confidence that they could outshoot their opponents. One veteran recalled, "With the Garand, I never felt outgunned." In that moment, a myth cracked. The myth of German superiority in weapons and tactics. The echo of those first firefights carried across North Africa, into Sicily, Italy, France, and eventually Germany itself. The M1 Garand became more than a weapon, it was a symbol, a sound, the steady rhythm of liberation. And as German prisoners began to trickle into American camps, their comments told the same story. Time and again, they remarked on the same shocking truth: each of your riflemen is worth 2 of ours. But how had this revolutionary weapon come to be? To understand the Garand's impact, we must rewind to the years before the war, when one engineer and a visionary army command reshaped the very nature of infantry combat. The story began not in the desert, but in the workshops of the Springfield Armory during the 1930s. Inside cavernous brick buildings, amid the clanging of machinery and the smell of oil and steel, a man named John Cantius Garand worked tirelessly at his bench. Garand was a Canadian-born machinist, a quiet, meticulous engineer who had immigrated to the United States as a child. By the late 1920s, he was designing rifles for the U.S. Army. His dream was to solve a problem soldiers had lived with for centuries: the pause between shots. At the time, nearly every army in the world relied on bolt-action rifles. Strong, accurate, and dependable, yes, but slow. Each shot required the shooter to work the bolt, eject the spent cartridge, load the next round, and re-aim. For hunters, this was acceptable. For soldiers in the modern age of mechanized war, it meant seconds lost, seconds that could mean death. Garand's breakthrough was a semi-automatic rifle using a gas-operated system. When a bullet was fired, the expanding gases cycled the action, ejecting the shell and loading the next round automatically. The shooter needed only to pull the trigger again. The Army tested many designs, but Garand's proved the most reliable. Chambered in the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the weapon offered range, accuracy, and above all, speed. Soldiers who tested it marveled. "It fires as fast as I can pull the trigger," one exclaimed during trials. But Garand's rifle had another innovation: the en-bloc clip. Instead of loading bullets one by one, soldiers inserted a clip of 8 rounds directly into the rifle. When the last round fired, the empty clip was ejected with a distinctive ping. That sound would become iconic on battlefields across the world. In 1936, after years of testing, the U.S. Army officially adopted the rifle as the U.S. Rifle Caliber .30 M1. It was the first semi-automatic rifle to be standard issue for an entire military force. At the time, few could imagine how revolutionary this decision would be. Other nations experimented with semi-automatics, but none adopted them widely. Germany's Kar 98K remained a bolt action. Britain held to the Lee Enfield. Japan used the Arisaka. Even the Soviet Union, which would later produce the SVT-40, never made it standard. Only America had the industrial capacity and vision to put such a rifle in the hands of every soldier. For John Garand, it was the culmination of years of quiet persistence. For the United States, it was a leap into the future of warfare. As the world edged closer to war, the U.S. Army began preparing to arm millions of men with the new rifle. And when Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, the race to produce Garands on a massive scale began. The story began not in the desert, but in the workshops of the Springfield Armory during the 1930s. Inside cavernous brick buildings, amid the clanging of machinery and the smell of oil and steel, a man named John Cantius Garand worked tirelessly at his bench. Garand was a Canadian-born machinist, a quiet, meticulous engineer who had immigrated to the United States as a child. By the late 1920s, he was designing rifles for the U.S. Army. His dream was to solve a problem soldiers had lived with for centuries: the pause between shots. At the time, nearly every army in the world relied on bolt-action rifles. Strong, accurate, and dependable, yes, but slow. Each shot required the shooter to work the bolt, eject the spent cartridge, load the next round, and re-aim. For hunters, this was acceptable. For soldiers in the modern age of mechanized war, it meant seconds lost, seconds that could mean death. Garand's breakthrough was a semi-automatic rifle using a gas-operated system. When a bullet was fired, the expanding gases cycled the action, ejecting the shell and loading the next round automatically. The shooter needed only to pull the trigger again. The Army tested many designs, but Garand's proved the most reliable. Chambered in the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the weapon offered range, accuracy, and above all, speed. Soldiers who tested it marveled. "It fires as fast as I can pull the trigger," one exclaimed during trials. But Garand's rifle had another innovation: the en-bloc clip. Instead of loading bullets one by one, soldiers inserted a clip of 8 rounds directly into the rifle. When the last round fired, the empty clip was ejected with a distinctive ping. That sound would become iconic on battlefields across the world. In 1936, after years of testing, the U.S. Army officially adopted the rifle as the U.S. Rifle Caliber .30 M1. It was the first semi-automatic rifle to be standard issue for an entire military force. At the time, few could imagine how revolutionary this decision would be. Other nations experimented with semi-automatics, but none adopted them widely. Germany's Kar 98K remained a bolt action. Britain held to the Lee Enfield. Japan used the Arisaka. Even the Soviet Union, which would later produce the SVT-40, never made it standard. Only America had the industrial capacity and vision to put such a rifle in the hands of every soldier. For John Garand, it was the culmination of years of quiet persistence. For the United States, it was a leap into the future of warfare. As the world edged closer to war, the U.S. Army began preparing to arm millions of men with the new rifle. And when Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, the race to produce Garands on a massive scale began. The winter of 1941 changed everything. Pearl Harbor was still smoking when America declared war, and the U.S. Army faced the urgent task of transforming from a modest peacetime force into a global juggernaut. At the heart of that transformation was the M1 Garand. Factories that had once built automobiles, typewriters, and washing machines suddenly roared with new purpose. Assembly lines stretched for blocks. Machines clattered day and night. Sparks showered from welding torches, and the smell of hot steel filled the air. Men and women alike poured into these factories: riveters, machinists, welders. African Americans, women, and immigrants all found themselves part of the massive industrial effort. Each worker knew that what they built with their hands could mean life or death for a soldier overseas. The Garand was not the simplest weapon to produce. Its gas system, en-bloc clip, and precision machining required meticulous work. But America had the industrial muscle to meet the challenge. By 1942, the Springfield Armory and Winchester repeating arms were producing thousands of rifles each week. Contracts expanded to International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson later in the war, ensuring a steady stream of rifles into the hands of new recruits. By mid-war, production exceeded 4 million rifles. It was an astonishing achievement. While Germany struggled to replace losses and ration ammunition, American troops could be confident that each new division shipped overseas would be fully armed with the Garand. For the young men who received their rifles in boot camp, it was more than just equipment. It was a rite of passage. In places like Fort Benning, Georgia, or Camp Roberts in California, drill instructors barked commands as recruits learned to march, shoot, and clean their new companions. The first time a recruit felt the weight of the Garand in his hands, about 9.5 pounds of walnut and steel, he understood he was holding something both deadly and dependable. They practiced the 8-round reload, shoving the clip into the magazine with a metallic snap, learning to avoid the notorious Garand thumb. When the bolt slammed forward too quickly, they listened for the distinctive metallic ping that rang out when the empty clip ejected. For some, that sound became both comfort and warning, proof that the rifle had done its work, but also a signal that more bullets were needed. Stories spread quickly among the ranks. Recruits heard whispers from the few combat veterans who had already fired their Garands in anger. "It doesn't jam in the mud," one Marine claimed. "You can drop a German before he chambers his next round." These tales fueled confidence. The rifle wasn't just another tool of war. It was a promise that American soldiers would never have to fight with less than the best. Contrast this with Germany's situation. Many German soldiers were still issued the Kar 98K, reliable, yes, but slow. Their submachine guns, like the MP40, were useful at close range, but limited in number. Semi-automatic rifles, like the G41 and G43, were developed, but never produced in numbers to rival the Garand. Simply put, Germany could not arm every soldier with a comparable weapon. Even Japanese forces clung to outdated bolt-action rifles, often lighter and less powerful than the Garand. In firefights, the difference in firepower was unmistakable. American units could unleash withering volleys that pinned enemies down, creating openings for flanking maneuvers or assaults. The Garand also reflected something deeper about America's approach to the war. It was not just about producing vast numbers of weapons, but about equipping every soldier with the best possible tools. It spoke to a philosophy that each man's life was worth protecting with superior firepower. One recruit later recalled, "The first time I fired the Garand, I knew I could trust it. It wasn't just the rifle. It was America itself, saying we weren't going to fight this war half prepared." By the time American forces shipped out for North Africa in 1942, the Garand was in their hands. Crates of rifles were loaded onto ships, stacked alongside tanks, jeeps, and crates of Spam and Hershey's chocolate bars. When those men disembarked in Morocco and Algeria, they brought with them not only the weight of American industry, but also a weapon that would soon shock the enemy. The Germans would discover in the deserts of Tunisia what those recruits already knew. The M1 Garand was no ordinary rifle. It was the sound of a new kind of war, faster, deadlier, and relentless. And when the first real clash came at Kasserine Pass, the rifle's reputation was carved into history. The chill of a February morning in 1943 hung over the barren canyons of Tunisia. The ground was rocky, dry, and littered with scrub. German and Italian forces, veterans hardened by years of campaigns, prepared to face the Americans in what would become their first major test against the Wehrmacht, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. The Germans expected an easy fight. Reports from Berlin described U.S. troops as inexperienced, soft, and clumsy. Their commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, believed his seasoned Africa Corps could outmaneuver and overwhelm this new opponent. After all, the Germans had faced British veterans, Soviet fanatics, and partisan fighters across Europe. What could America's green recruits possibly bring that was new? The answer came in a sound that echoed through the canyons. When German infantry moved forward to probe American lines, they expected to hear the familiar rhythm of bolt-action fire. Crack, pause, crack. That cadence had defined rifle combat for decades. But instead, they heard something strange. Bang, 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 bang. A steady stream of shots rang out, fast and unrelenting. At first, German officers assumed they were under fire from machine guns. Reports flashed across the field radios. Enemy positions equipped with light automatics. Units advanced cautiously, bracing for belt-fed weapons hidden in the rocks. Yet what they discovered was even more unsettling. The rapid fire came not from a handful of machine guns, but from nearly every American infantryman. The M1 Garand had drawn its first blood, pinned in gullies and behind rocks. German soldiers cursed as American rifle fire cut through their ranks. The Garand's semi-automatic action allowed GIs to fire again and again without breaking aim. A squad of Americans could unleash a volume of fire that seemed more like a machine gun section than a handful of riflemen. One German corporal wrote afterward, "It was as though every man was armed with a light machine gun. We could not lift our heads without bullets striking around us." For the Americans, the battle was chaotic, even disastrous in its opening days. Many units were poorly coordinated. Commanders fumbled orders. German tanks sliced through untested lines, and artillery rained down with merciless precision. At Kasserine Pass, the U.S. Army was humbled by Rommel's tactical genius. But amid the chaos, one truth stood out. American infantrymen, armed with Garands, did not lack for firepower. Private First Class James O'Hara, a young GI from Ohio, later recalled crouching in a shallow foxhole, his Garand cradled against his shoulder. "I remember firing until the barrel smoked. They kept coming, but every time they showed themselves, we put them back down. I never once had to reach for the bolt." The Germans took note. After the battle, intelligence officers compiled captured rifles and ammunition, studying them carefully. Reports circulated through the Wehrmacht. The American rifle was unlike anything they had faced before. Soldiers complained that each GI fought with the firepower of 2 or 3 men. The psychological effect was immense. German infantrymen, used to the slow rhythm of bolt actions, now faced opponents who fired without pause. The ping of an empty Garand clip, ringing across the battlefield, became a signal, both dreaded and oddly respected. Germans learned to listen for it, for when the clip ejected, there was a split-second window before the American reloaded. Yet even that advantage was fleeting, for the reload was fast, and the volume of fire returned almost instantly. Though Kasserine Pass ended in tactical defeat for the United States, it marked a turning point in perception. The Germans realized America was not a nation of amateurs. Its soldiers might be untested, its generals inexperienced, but its weapons and industrial capacity were formidable. The Garand symbolized that shock. Rommel himself is said to have remarked to his staff that the Americans would learn quickly, and when they did, their equipment would make them dangerous. The battle left deep scars on both sides. For the Americans, it was a painful lesson in modern war. For the Germans, it was the first hint that the tide of firepower was shifting, and in the months to come, as American forces regrouped and pushed deeper into Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy, the Garand would prove again and again that it was no ordinary rifle. From the smoking canyons of North Africa, its reputation spread across Europe. German officers began noting in their field reports, "Each American rifleman is like two of ours." The rifle that John Garand had built in quiet workshops years before was now shaping the outcome of battles thousands of miles away. And as the war moved forward, the shock of the Garand would only grow. For the Germans, it became a weapon not only of steel and lead, but of fear, a reminder that the enemy across the line was armed with something they had no answer for. In the months following Kasserine Pass, German officers filed intelligence reports that revealed a growing unease. They had expected the Americans to be poorly trained and poorly equipped. Instead, they discovered that the typical U.S. infantryman carried a rifle unlike any they had seen before. A captured report circulated among Wehrmacht units in 1943 read bluntly, "Each American rifleman is the equal of two of ours." The weapon in question, the M1 Garand, had left its mark not only on the battlefield but in the minds of its opponents. For German soldiers accustomed to the bolt-action carabiner 98K, the difference was undeniable. The Kar 98K was accurate, rugged, and effective, but it demanded time. Fire, bolt, fire, bolt. Under pressure, those seconds stretched into lifetimes. Against American riflemen, who could unleash a stream of shots without pause, German squads often found themselves suppressed before they could respond. Luftwaffe pilots flying low over battlefields noted how American units seemed to saturate entire areas with rifle fire. To German infantry, this was bewildering. How could so many shots come from so few men? Some assumed at first that the Americans had issued automatic rifles to every soldier. Others believed they carried hidden machine guns. The truth was even more unsettling. This was standard equipment. German diaries, captured after battles, reveal frustration and envy. One soldier wrote, "It is not fair. We must labor the bolt like hunters, but they fire as quickly as they can breathe." Another, a sergeant on the Eastern Front transferred to France, admitted, "The Russians were brave, but their rifles no better than ours. The Americans carry something new. It breaks our nerve." In response, German units leaned heavily on machine guns to compensate. The MG-34 and MG-42 were devastating weapons, capable of spitting hundreds of rounds per minute. German doctrine made the squad revolve around its machine gun, with riflemen supporting it. But this created a cruel irony. When machine guns were silenced by artillery or overwhelmed by Garand-equipped infantry, the remaining riflemen were often hopelessly outmatched. Attempts were made to answer America's advantage. The semi-automatic G41 and later the G43 were introduced, mimicking some of the Garand's features. But production numbers were small, plagued by reliability problems and the limits of Germany's shrinking industry. By war's end, only a fraction of German troops carried them. Meanwhile, America was arming every soldier with the Garand, and its factories never slowed. To the average German infantryman, it felt like facing an enemy that could not only replace its losses, but replace them with superior weapons. For many Germans, the psychological weight was as heavy as the tactical one. Facing an American squad meant expecting twice the fire they could return. Even the sound of battle was demoralizing. Survivors remembered the distinct difference: the crisp rhythm of bolt actions replaced by the relentless hammering of semi-automatics. Some soldiers clung to their training and ideology. They believed discipline and courage would carry the day. Others began to doubt. If the enemy could equip every man with such weapons, what else might they have in store? In time, the Garand became more than a rifle. It was a symbol of America's industrial power, its determination to outproduce and outgun its enemies. For German officers, it was proof that the war was shifting. For German foot soldiers, it was a daily reminder that the man in the opposite trench had the edge. By 1944, as reports mounted and battles intensified, one truth echoed through German ranks: the Americans were no longer underestimated. They were respected, even feared, and much of that respect came not from tanks or planes, but from the weapon cradled in every GI's hands. The Garand was shaping not just combat, but the morale of both sides. For U.S. troops, it was a source of confidence. For German troops, it was a source of dread. And that contrast would only sharpen as the war moved into Europe's heartland. For the men who carried it, the M1 Garand was more than just a piece of equipment. It became a trusted companion, a lifeline, and sometimes the difference between life and death. Private Robert E. Johnson, who fought in Italy, later wrote, "My rifle saved me. It was heavy, yes, but I would have carried two if I could. With it, I felt I had a fighting chance." Every recruit who passed through American training camps in the early 1940s learned quickly that the Garand was their closest ally. Instructors drilled them relentlessly, making sure each soldier could reload by instinct, strip and clean the weapon blindfolded, and fire accurately at targets hundreds of yards away. The rifle was not merely issued, it was bonded to its owner. The Garand's reputation for reliability only deepened that bond. Soldiers discovered it could withstand rain, mud, and the chaos of combat without failing. On the beaches of Sicily, men dragged their rifles through surf and sand. In the forests of Belgium, they fought with Garands crusted in snow and ice. Time and again, the rifles fired. It always went bang, one veteran recalled simply. And then there was the sound. Every GI came to know the metallic ping that rang out when the rifle's N-block clip ejected after the last round. For Americans, the sound was almost comforting, a cue to reload, drilled into muscle memory. But for Germans who learned to recognize it, the ping could mean opportunity. Some swore they waited to hear it before charging, knowing the rifleman had a brief window of vulnerability. Still, many American soldiers learned to fire in staggered rhythms, ensuring there was always someone covering when a comrade reloaded. The Garand's quirks became part of its character, and GIs adapted with ingenuity. In foxholes and bivouacs, rifles were given nicknames: Betsy, Old Reliable, the Equalizer. Men oiled them carefully, brushed dirt from their actions, and slept with them close at hand. A Garand was not just a tool of war, it was a soldier's security blanket. Unlike the bolt actions carried by most enemies, the Garand encouraged aggressiveness. GIs could fire quickly, advance confidently, and overwhelm enemy positions with sheer volume. This gave them a psychological edge. You felt strong, remembered Sergeant Henry Ramos. "With 8 shots ready to go, you didn't have to hesitate. That gave us courage." There were drawbacks, of course. The rifle was heavy, nearly 10 pounds when loaded. Lugging it up hills in Italy or through the hedgerows of Normandy could exhaust even the strongest recruit. The .30-06 ammunition, powerful and effective, also added weight when carried in bandoliers across a soldier's chest. But most GIs considered the burden worth it. Better a heavy rifle that fired fast and true than a lighter one that left you outgunned. In the rare moments of rest, Garands leaned against sandbags or rested across laps while their owners smoked, wrote letters, or ate rations. Yet even then, soldiers often glanced at them, checking that they were within reach. In the unpredictable chaos of war, trust in the rifle was trust in survival. Some soldiers recalled the pride of hearing their weapons fire echo across the battlefield, drowning out the slower rhythm of enemy rifles. It gave them a sense of superiority, of belonging to a modern army that valued its men enough to arm them with the best. For the American GI, the Garand was not just steel and wood. It was reassurance in the fog of war, a constant presence when comrades fell, and sometimes the last sound a soldier heard before silence, the ping that closed one firefight and signaled readiness for the next. In the words of General George S. Patton, the Garand was the greatest battle implement ever devised. For those who carried it, that was not an empty boast. It was lived reality, written in sweat, mud, and blood. And when the invasion of Europe began in 1944, the Garand would prove its worth again on the beaches and fields of France. Dawn broke over the English Channel on June 6, 1944. The horizon burned with the thunder of naval guns, and waves of landing craft cut across the churning water. Inside those craft, drenched and seasick, American soldiers clutched their rifles, the M1 Garand, knowing it might be the only thing keeping them alive once the ramps dropped. When the doors slammed open at Omaha, Utah, and the other beaches, the chaos was indescribable. Mortar fire churned the sand, machine guns swept the shoreline, and smoke mingled with salt spray. But through it all, Garands barked their relentless rhythm. 8 shots, reload, 8 more. German defenders, armed largely with bolt-action rifles and machine guns in fortified nests, were stunned by the sheer volume of rifle fire pouring back at them. It wasn't just 1 or 2 soldiers firing quickly, it was entire waves of men, each armed with a weapon that could keep up a steady stream of shots. They fired faster than we believed possible, a captured German later admitted. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the Garand became indispensable. The thick earthen walls and dense vegetation turned every field into a fortress. German snipers and machine gunners waited for any movement, yet GIs learned to fight with speed and aggression, using their rifles to lay down fire as they pushed from hedgerow to hedgerow. Squads coordinated so that one group pinned down defenders while another maneuvered. The Garand's firepower gave Americans the confidence to press forward in terrain that should have favored the defenders. Sergeant William Hayes described the experience in a letter home. "The rifle feels like it was made for this country. You don't have time to work a bolt. You need to fire and move." The Garand makes that possible. German soldiers, who had once believed themselves masters of infantry combat, now faced a new reality. Even when they outnumbered American patrols, the Americans' ability to fire rapidly and accurately often tipped the balance. Machine gun nests that might have dominated ground against slower-firing opponents were silenced by concentrated volleys from Garands. Beyond Normandy, as the Allies pushed across France and into Belgium, the weapon's reputation only grew. In city streets, where fighting was fast and chaotic, soldiers valued the Garand's quick follow-up shots. In open fields, its accuracy at long range allowed them to challenge German marksmen. Whether storming towns like St. Lo or holding ground in the forests near the Ardennes, the rifle was the constant companion of every GI. Even among the Allies, envy was common. British and Canadian troops, equipped with their reliable Lee Enfields, admired the Garand's speed. Soviet troops, who occasionally encountered American rifles through Lend-Lease or captured stockpiles, were amazed that every U.S. soldier carried one. To them, it was proof of America's unmatched industrial might. For the Germans, the realization was bitter. Their army, once the most feared in the world, now fought an enemy whose basic rifle could deliver overwhelming firepower. They had machine guns, yes, but those were few, often fixed, and relying on crews. Against waves of Garands, even their vaunted MG-42s struggled when infantrymen pressed in relentlessly. Normandy was the crucible where the Garand earned its place in legend. From the blood-soaked sands of Omaha to the green hedgerows where soldiers crawled through mud and fear, the rifle gave the American soldier a fighting edge. And as the Allies surged eastward through France, Belgium, and finally toward the Rhine, its metallic ping echoed from the ruins of villages and the forests alike, a sound that told friend and foe alike that America's firepower would not be stopped. The war was far from over, but with every battle, the Garand became more than a weapon. It became the voice of American infantry, and as the German army reeled, that voice grew louder with each mile gained. By late 1944, the Garand was no longer just a rifle. For German soldiers, it had become a sound that haunted them. In towns, in forests, on open plains, wherever the Americans fought, the rhythm of rapid rifle fire announced their presence. A German lieutenant in France admitted to his men, "They fire without pause, as if endless. Even when we cannot see them, we know they are there by the hammering of their rifles." That sense of inevitability, of being outgunned before the battle even began, was one of the Garand's most potent weapons. The psychological edge was real. German infantry, drilled in the use of bolt actions, found themselves second-guessing every decision. To move across open ground under Garand fire was suicide. To defend in trenches meant enduring a hail of shots that seemed never to stop. Even small American patrols could convince larger German units that they faced superior numbers simply by the sheer volume of fire their rifles produced. The irony was striking. For years, German propaganda had painted Americans as soft, undisciplined, and reliant on machines rather than skill. Yet here, in the mud and blood of Europe, it was German soldiers who felt mechanical disadvantage. The Americans carried a weapon that turned ordinary infantrymen into something more. Fighters with the ability to dominate skirmishes through speed and firepower. For U.S. troops, this advantage translated into confidence. A GI who knew his rifle could keep firing without pause often stood his ground longer, advanced faster, and pressed the attack harder. "It gave you guts," one soldier said. "Knowing you could keep firing when the other guy had to stop, that made you braver." But the rifle's psychological toll extended beyond the battlefield. Captured prisoners often expressed disbelief that every American soldier carried such a weapon. Some even asked to handle Garands in POW cages, testing their weight, pulling the trigger, shaking their heads in silence. To them, it symbolized not just superior firepower, but the endless resources of a nation that could produce millions of such rifles. German attempts to counter the psychological blow came too late. Semi-automatics like the G43 and automatic rifles like the STG-44 were introduced in limited numbers, but they never reached enough troops to change the balance. By the time they appeared, the Garand had already etched its reputation into the minds of German soldiers. On both sides of the line, the rifle had become part of the mental war. For Americans, it was reassurance. The sound of comrades firing beside them, the knowledge they could return more shots than they received. For Germans, it was dread, the sound of defeat echoing in rapid bursts, telling them the enemy was stronger, faster, and more prepared. As the war dragged into its final months, that psychological imbalance grew heavier. And nowhere would it matter more than in the desperate battles of the Ardennes, where snow and fire collided in the last great German offensive of the West. The winter of 1944-45 brought with it Germany's last gamble. The Ardennes offensive, remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. Snow blanketed the forests of Belgium, muffling the sound of marching boots and tank treads as German forces pushed through in a desperate attempt to split the Allied lines. In their foxholes, American soldiers huddled against the biting cold, their Garands resting across their knees. The icy wind cut through wool coats, frost gathered on helmets, and rifles grew stiff with frozen grease. Yet when the Germans attacked, the Garand again proved itself, not just as a weapon of firepower, but as a tool of survival in the harshest conditions. German infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, surged forward. They expected to overwhelm tired American units, many of them young replacements. But as they advanced, the forests erupted with Garand fire. The crisp, rapid shots echoed across snow-covered ridges, cutting down attackers before they could close in. Private Charles Whitman later wrote, "I thought we were finished when I saw them coming through the snow, but the rifle just kept firing. 8 shots, reload, 8 more. We laid it down so thick they couldn't move." The Garand gave American defenders a fighting chance in what could have been disaster. Though many units were overrun in the first days of the offensive, countless others held their ground long enough for reinforcements to arrive. German soldiers who once believed the Americans were easy prey now found themselves once again outgunned, forced to retreat under the hail of semi-automatic fire. As the Allies regained the initiative and pushed eastward into Germany, the Garand's role only grew. In ruined towns, soldiers fired from shattered windows, the rifles' heavy rounds cracking through rubble and smoke. In forests, patrols relied on the Garand's speed to ambush retreating Germans. On open fields, squads advanced behind a wall of fire that only semi-automatic rifles could maintain. By spring 1945, German morale was crumbling. Fuel shortages grounded planes, ammunition was scarce, and replacements were rushed to the front with barely any training. Against them stood American soldiers, each armed with a rifle that could unleash more shots in less time than their foes could answer. The imbalance was devastating. One German officer captured near the Rhine confessed to his interrogators, "We could not understand how every one of your men had such a weapon. For us, only a few specialists carried semi-automatics. For you, it was everyone. It broke our hearts." At the same time, for American GIs, the Garand remained a constant companion. They carried it across rivers on makeshift rafts, through the mud of spring thaws, and into the ruins of cities like Cologne. When the U.S. Army reached the Elbe, and when Soviet troops closed in on Berlin, the Garand was in nearly every American hand. The rifle had become part of the story of victory itself. Soldiers remembered its weight, its recoil, and that iconic metallic ping as empty clips sprang free. For many, it was the last sound of each firefight, marking survival and the chance to reload for another day. As the Reich collapsed and Hitler's army surrendered, German veterans admitted privately that the Garand had shocked them more than any tank or plane. It represented not just superior firepower, but the reality that America's industrial strength was impossible to match. From the desert canyons of Tunisia to the frozen forests of Belgium, the Garand had shaped battles and saved lives. And as GIs marched home victorious, they carried with them not only medals and scars, but also memories of a rifle that had never let them down. The war in Europe ended, but the legacy of the Garand was only beginning. The guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945, but the story of the M1 Garand did not end with the surrender of Germany. Instead, its legend grew, not just as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of American ingenuity and determination. General George S. Patton, never a man of modest words, famously declared, "In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised." For the soldiers who carried it across continents, that statement rang true. The Garand was not perfect. It was heavy, it required careful maintenance, but it was reliable, powerful, and fast. In the crucible of battle, it had given the average American infantryman a decisive edge. In the years after World War II, the Garand marched again into combat. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, American troops carried their familiar rifles up icy hills and through valleys choked with snow. Once again, soldiers found comfort in its 8 rounds of .30-06 power. Veterans of both wars spoke of the same trust. When you pulled the trigger, the Garand fired. When you needed it most, it delivered. Beyond its battlefield service, the rifle became a cultural icon. Returning GIs told stories of its weight on their shoulders, of the metallic ping that meant both danger and survival. Many gave their rifles nicknames, recalling them as if they were comrades who had shared the mud, fear, and victories. In VFW halls and reunions, the Garand was remembered with reverence. For German veterans, the memories were different, tinged with bitterness, awe, and respect. Many recalled the shock of facing entire companies of Americans armed with semi-automatics. Some admitted privately that the Garand had shattered their morale more than any tank or bomber. To them, the rifle symbolized America's overwhelming industrial power, the ability not only to arm its men, but to arm them better than anyone else in the world. The rifle also shaped the post-war era in more subtle ways. Surplus Garands were shipped to allies across the globe, from South Korea to Greece. They armed soldiers, police, and freedom fighters. They appeared in conflicts far removed from the beaches of Normandy or the snows of the Ardennes, carrying with them echoes of the Second World War. Collectors and historians came to prize the Garand as a piece of living history. Firing ranges across America echoed with its deep, powerful crack. Museums displayed it as a centerpiece of the soldier's story. Veterans passed them down to children and grandchildren, their wood stocks scarred with dents from foxholes and marches. Even today, the M1 Garand holds a place of honor. The U.S. Army's ceremonial units drill with them at Arlington National Cemetery. They fire in salute at funerals for the fallen, the familiar sound of the rifle linking generations of service. For Americans, it is more than steel and wood, it is heritage. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Garand lies not in ceremonies or collections, but in memory. For the men who fought with it, the rifle was inseparable from the experience of the war itself. It was the weight in their hands as they stepped off landing craft, the sound that filled hedgerows and cities, the reassurance when fear threatened to overwhelm them. In the words of one veteran, "It was heavy, it kicked, and it saved my life more times than I can count. That rifle was my best friend." For German troops, it was the weapon that marked a turning point, a symbol of America's ability to outproduce, outgun, and outlast. They had expected to face a nation of amateurs with second-rate weapons. Instead, they encountered a rifle that gave every GI the power of 2 men. The M1 Garand remains etched in history as both a technological milestone and a psychological weapon. It was not just a tool of war, it was a statement of strength, a message that America's factories, engineers, and soldiers were united in a common purpose. And in the quiet moments of reflection, decades later, veterans remembered not just the battles, but the sound, the unmistakable metallic ping of an empty clip. To some, it meant fear. To others, it meant survival. To history, it became the echo of a rifle that changed the course of a world at war.